We're going to record it today. Did that work okay? Yeah, the red light's on. We're cool. Okay, so today to start the discussion, I want to talk about civil liberties, and we're going to start with a fellow named Ben Franklin. Does anybody know who Ben was? Who was? Who was Ben?
He was a very influential person during the American Revolution.
Right, and what gave him influence? What kind of influence did he have? What did he do? You're right. I want you to give me more if you can. That's okay if you can't, too. Yeah, he invented the Einstein hairdo. He went out in a rainstorm with a kite and... No, he didn't. But, yeah, he did. Electricity.
Kind of on Quaker Oats, almost. He's kind of on the Quaker Oats, just a little.
He's on the Quaker Oats. He also invented, if I got this right, he invented the almanac.
He's on money.
He's on money, too. Wait a minute, let me check that out now. You know, there was a time when this was backed with something real. It was called gold. And then when they took away the gold, they backed it with silver. It used to say silver certificate, so if you could really get real. And now it's called paper. Good faith. Good faith. Anybody else have any ideas about Ben? Anybody take Professor Walter's course? American history? Nobody? Oh, be careful when you do that. I think you're raising your hand. Okay, well, Ben Franklin turns out is one of the founding people of this country. He wrote some of the documents. His name is signed on it. He happens to be the governor of Pennsylvania when he makes this quote, but this quote has followed him throughout all of our history. Ben says, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." This is a land that's based on libertarian freedom. People still want to come here because they hear about this dream that people can be free. I've been in 17 countries. I've been in countries where you do not have freedom. This country is still presumed innocent until proven guilty. There are other countries that live under what we call a French law. You're guilty till you prove you're innocent. That would be a horrible situation, especially if you're in jail. How do you prove you're innocent? People still want to come here because the values of freedom. Now, freedom is not totally free. We have limited freedom, but we try and maximize freedom. No lying, stealing, cheating, raping, robbing. But to the extent that we can maximize freedom, that's what libertarian political philosophy is all about. And Ben was there at the beginning, and these people literally shed their blood for these freedoms. Freedom is not free. In the current political climate, some people get really sarcastic. Oh, freedom's not free. I was in northern Michigan at a ball game. It must have been like a A-type ball game, you know, I don't know. Stadium, pretty decent size, maybe 2,000 people in a big jumbotron out there. It was seventh inning, and everyone takes a seventh inning stretch. You know, oh, he's just stretched it out. And they flashed a picture of a young boy your age on the jumbotron, and they said, I forget his name now, they said he just passed away. He was killed in combat over in Afghanistan the week that the game was being played, and we had a moment of silence. And then I'd never heard this before. The announcer said, "Now, before you sit down, will all current and former military please remain standing?" And everybody sat down. There was just a handful of us. I was in row 8, a guy in row 4 over there. I figured out he was probably from Nam, and a guy behind us either got in between the Korean War and the Vietnam War, or he was late into the Korean. And it was just a handful of people, and I remember thinking, who's watching the fort? Well, that's in August. Go forward to the next March, and Joe, my middle boy, is down here. My special needs boy comes down to watch the Tigers camp. And I took him to SeaWorld, which is like 4,000 or 5,000 people watching the orca whales, and they had everyone stand up in the national anthem. We get all done, and then again this voice says, "Now before you sit down, will all current and former military please remain standing?" And almost everybody sat down, and I thought, who is watching the fort? Any of you take drafting, I think, with Jack Plant over in the G building? We call him Colonel Jack. He did 3 tours in Vietnam. He was in Special Forces over there. I mentioned it to Jack, and he said, well, you know, only 1.25% of the Americans are guarding the fort. Everyone else is free to do whatever they want to do under the protection of just a small number of people. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you don't guard your freedoms, you don't have your freedoms. And all you got to do is leave this country and go to another country and find out that the freedoms we enjoy here, there are other countries that are free out there, but they don't enjoy the freedoms that we enjoy here. And the problem then with being born into a land of the free is that you're born into it. You don't have to defend it. You can just enjoy it, and I'm glad you can do that. You don't have to defend it. But we lose then some of the value of what Ben is saying. If you think giving up some of your essential freedoms to make yourself feel safer is worth it, he thinks you don't deserve any of it. These are people literally spilled their blood so that we could be free from England, from the crown. And look, we don't have it right. I mean, we know that. If you go to the polls today, you're going to see so much conflict, you know. But we try and work it out so that we preserve freedom. Everybody understand what I'm talking about here? So this is a very important quote. It has gone for 240 some odd years. People remember what Ben said. Some people argue, well, he was only the governor of Pennsylvania. It's irrelevant. What he said is very relevant. These freedoms cost people their lives so we could live under the mantle of freedom and not have to worry about it. You don't have to wake up tomorrow and wonder where the First Amendment went, or the Second, or the Third, or the Fourth. Any of the amendments, they're there. And for those things to change, there has to be a radical revolution in this country. We tried it back in the 1860s. It didn't work. We maintained the republic, and here we are today trying to work out these freedoms with one another. So any questions about what Ben says? Ben's there for a reason, people. This is nuts and bolts today. Okay. Well, what did he mean by these freedoms? So in the Declaration, we declare that it's our right to throw off tyranny. Now, throw off is different than overthrow. I had the discussion with a gentleman in class, and he was very upset with me. He said that, bless you, he said that throw off and overthrow are the same thing. They're not. These people were educated people, and they chose these words very carefully. I'm going to go home today, and I'm going to throw off this garb and put on my blue jeans and what I think is, you know, representation of who I am. This, therefore, was called the Declaration of Independence, not a declaration of war. If it was a declaration of war, we'd have overthrown the crown. But we threw off tyranny, and we knew we were going to go to war. There's no way the king was going to let us go without a fight. So this is the genesis. This is the beginning of where our freedoms begin, that we have a right in the face of tyranny to throw off any form of government that threatens our tyranny, that threatens our freedoms. So let me say this to you. Here's freedom, and here's tyranny. And there's almost an invisible line that separates the two. Anybody want to venture a guess? An invisible line. It's so thin we hardly see it, and we're not aware of it. Here's tyranny, and here's freedom, and here's this thin line that separates us. Well, I'll help you out with it. It's called vigilance. There's nothing in the sacred documents that tells the government to protect our rights. The Constitution is purposely designed to limit what the government can do to us. And there's even a phrase in there that says any powers not enumerated to the government, not mentioned to the government, automatically belong to the people, government of and for and by the people. If we don't guard our freedoms, it's easy to drift this way. You give someone an inch, maybe they want to take a mile. So Ben says we need to be vigilant about our freedoms. Because if you start surrendering them, even suspending them, you might find out that you don't have the freedoms that you thought you had. You know how you get lost in the forest? Here's the path through the forest, right? Okay, so I take one step off the path. I can find my way back. Before you know it, you can't find your way home. And so Ben says we need to guard these rights. We need to guard these rights. I'm not saying the government's bad. But this was purposely set up so that people could regulate their freedoms. And therefore we have the right to safeguard them. And if we give up that right, we shouldn't be surprised if we don't have them. That's why Ben's so important. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. And they were serious about it, and they did lay down. People were still laying our lives down to maintain freedom. Okay? Which brings me to the First Amendment. The amendments almost didn't make it into the Constitution. By the way, the amendments are part of the Constitution. 1776, the Declaration of Independence. You don't mind a little history, do you? 11 years later, 1787, we get the U.S. Constitution, which purposely limits the government, both state, local, and federal. We have to wait another 4 years until 1791 before we get the amendments. The original writers of the Constitution didn't want to put the amendments in there because they thought if you put them in there by law, you can take them away. And they're inalienable. Last time I read in the Declaration that you were endowed by your Creator with certain inalienable rights that you couldn't be removed from. Well, they went ahead and took a chance and they put it in there. The First Amendment is probably the most important. Tommy Jefferson called this the People's Amendment. Congress shall make no law. How many laws? No laws. 0 laws respecting an establishment of religion. So the government couldn't establish a religion. Now, why would they do that? Well, it turns out back in the day of King George, when we belonged to the king, he did not want to be married to the lady he was married to. In fact, now this is not a religious statement. I'm not meaning to step on toes, but everybody back then was Catholic, and so he went to the Pope to get his marriage annulled. That means zeroed out, doesn't exist. And the Pope said no. And George said, fine, I'll start my own church. And he goes back to England, he starts the Church of England. Well, we're having this transition of divine right of kings to sharing power with the elite. And part of that then is he said, fine, you want to share power? Join my church. If you didn't join my church, you can't be part of the power structure. So they all joined the church. And we knew that. So when we came here and we wrote the First Amendment, we said the government cannot start a religion. Because next thing you know, you got to join the church in order to have a power structure, and the power is supposed to belong to the people, not to the leadership. So, Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting people if they want to worship. It doesn't say church there. Any religion. They were willing. You want to worship a deity? Go ahead and worship a deity. It's your choice. The government can't say no, like in communism, and the government can't get in the church business. It's your right. It's not their right. No law respecting the freedom of speech, or the freedom of the press, or the right of the people to peacefully, non-violently assemble and petition their government for redress of grievances. In other words, to chew their government out, peacefully, protesting, non-violent. Everybody get that? Government shall make no laws, either getting in the way of the people's right if they want to worship or not, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and the right of the people to peacefully protest against their government. 1791. Interestingly enough, who's the first president? George. The second president? It's okay, I'll help you with that. A fellow named John Adams. And John, evidently, when he was growing up at his mother's knee, did not learn that sticks and stones can hurt my bones, but names will never harm me. So 7 years later, we're having problems with France. We have enemies, both foreign and domestic. And John has Congress pass what's called the Alien Act. It's got 3 parts to it to keep foreigners, both domestic and from troubling the government. But then he added something called the Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act says this. Whoops.